All right, welcome to Podcraft. Recently on the show, we've been doing a few coaching calls with listeners of the show. They've been really enjoyable so far, and I'm pleased to say we're going to do another one today with Cody. How you doing, Cody?
I'm doing great. How are you, Matthew?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Yeah, great to catch up with you over in Colorado, I believe, over in Denver.
Yep.
And joined as well by my humble apprentice, Colin. How you doing, son?
It's good. Not too bad, Matthew. Not too bad. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Not in as place nice as Denver, of course, but close.
Yeah.
I don't know. Scotland is one of the prettiest, most welcoming countries that I've been to. So if you guys are in Scotland, I might trade with you.
Well, last time I came to Denver, I got a bit of skiing in, so I'm jealous of that. The fact that you've got such good mountains close by. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of such, Cody, I was listening to the start of one of your recent episodes there, and it opened with you saying that you were away up in the mountains doing some recording. So I guess this ties in to the kind of theme of your show overall. So I would like you to start maybe by just telling us a bit about the podcast itself before we start diving into areas you're maybe looking for some tips or advice.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of a podcast relaunch. I had been doing a podcast with a partner who's now doing their PhD in the UK. So just the timing of like making a podcast happen, we decided to put it on pause. And then I have a love of podcasting, so I started my own podcast in the meantime. And when I first started this relaunch, I was doing it solo, where I wasn't doing interview episodes. It's just me in front of a microphone. And I wanted to get a feel of that. And I quickly realized that my love of podcasting comes from meeting and talking with people and learning about what they're doing and helping elevate their story. It's not just me sitting in front of a microphone talking. So the focus of the podcast now, it's elevating the people who are helping build a more sustainable, creative, and resilient communities on a community level. Just with all the chaos and bad news happening, I want to focus on the people who are helping and doing good in this world. And I think it will be a refreshing podcast compared to just talking about what's going wrong and what is happening on the climate catastrophe. So my background is in environmental science and community level sustainability, and that's really where I'm focusing the podcast at.
Colin, now that we've got a wee bit of background about what Cody's up to, are there any questions that immediately jump out to you there that you might want to find out more about?
Yeah, there was thanks for sending through the detail, Cody. You had a bunch of great questions in there, so we'll hopefully dig into at least a few of them today, if not maybe even an addition to sometime in future as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of questions that I sent, and it was just like the questions that I have on an ongoing basis as I'm podcasting. So if we get to none of them, or if we get to some of them, that'd be awesome.
Perfect. Well, one of the things I found really interesting was and you mentioned this in your questions, your almost mix between local and more general content. So obviously you talk about kind of focusing in on the Denver, Colorado area, potentially your own community, talking to people in your community, running an event in your community as well. So, but equally the concepts you're talking about widen out into the larger, world. So, but they're two very different types of shows in many ways, a local show and a general show. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you see it applying to the local area as opposed to more general? Because there's so much power in a local show. It's such a great model. So it'd be interesting to see if that's kind of where you really want to take it, because the advice depends a whole lot on that, really.
Yeah, and that's where I'm focusing at this moment. Like this past week, I've interviewed 3 people locally in podcast studio where we're in the same room, which is completely new to me in my podcasting journey. But what I'm doing is, alongside the podcast, I have created a pop-up event where once a month we transform a Denver warehouse into a community hub for what we talk about on the podcast. So we have local artists, we have sustainable businesses, we have upcycled clothing, we have other community organizations not just related to the environment and climate. And my goal is to create that real world through line to like have a place where we can build real community. And I haven't said it yet. The name of my rebranded podcast is the Community Build Up Podcast. So I'm trying to tie them together where the podcast, we can amplify the message of and make it permanent and reach it to anyone who does want to listen to what we're talking about. But the overall focus is going to be how we can get people to organize locally here in Denver, more or less, with the Denver's community pop-up market, the pop-up market that I have launched. And the way that I see this working out with the podcast, where I haven't even released this relaunch, but I'm already getting more local subscribers because when we do our event outreach, I have a little tag at the bottom like, listen to us at the Community Build Up Podcast. And then all of our vendors are sharing that across social media. All of our flyers that we put up in the coffee shops and around town will have that Community Build Up Podcast. So it's a way that I'm able to reach people locally rather fast without me even having to release an episode yet of this podcast. Because, like I said, I'm still in the recording phase. But I guess where I see the difference between locally and like a podcast meant for anyone anywhere is the ideas are going to be like the guests right now are mostly people here in Denver. I've interviewed some people in Chicago as well. So, like, we're talking about what's happening in Denver, but the goal is to relate this so anyone who wants to know how they can start building better, more sustainable community can take the advice that we're talking about and relate it to their own world. And yeah, I guess that's a little bit more information about how I'm trying to connect it to a local level.
Yeah, that's really cool. Because there's so many tactics that work really nice for growing a local show. Like you've mentioned a couple there, like if you can record at events or you can get events involved. Like, are you doing a recording at your pop-up event just now, for example?
So I have it scheduled, like I have it in the works, but it's just me running the podcast, running the pop-up market, organize all the vendors, doing all the social media content, and getting people to sign up for our email list, the attendees when they come in. So I'm doing a lot right now. So I haven't had the ability to start implementing the in-person recording, but it's been so neat to see this pop-up market grow. On our largest event, we've had almost 800 people show up at a random warehouse at a random time and a random day. So the pop-up is really having an effect in our community.
That's really cool. That's great. The thing that occurred to me was around the power of that local community. The fact that you could grow a really great, successful podcast around the Denver area, but so many local shows are much more around, just general local events, community news, things like that. But then obviously that is completely uninteresting to anyone outside of
Yeah.
Denver. So I wonder if there is something though around you telling those stories around how to build better community, more connected community, all of those things that you've mentioned that are really interesting to people in Denver because you're telling the stories of Denver. You're talking about how people in Denver can get involved in that building and do more of it themselves. And that relates to anyone listening. So maybe that's the first like 2/3 of the show, but there might be even something kind of powerful about there being a purely local section at the end where you do actually do a little bit of genuine local news or community events coming up or things like that, which makes it a real, go-to place for people around in and around your community. And that then brings in so much other growth opportunities like, partnering with local businesses and giving them a shout out when they give a shout out to you, or like put a poster up in the local gym or hairdresser or something like that. Or even just the simple stuff like you start getting into traditional advertising like cards and flyers and posters and stickers and all of that kind of stuff. But most of that only generally comes in, or it certainly comes in more powerfully if you have that more just local news, community news, events coming up, all that kind of stuff. But there is something interesting. You do have an angle there in which, you're talking about local community building in Denver. So even that is interesting to at least a proportion of your local people while still giving that outside story as well. So I'm not sure if that is a tactic to go down, really maybe find that balance somehow.
Yeah, and I like that idea of maybe having something at the very end where it's just local locally focused. Right now, we're ending on the show with like practical advice where people can anywhere if they want to start taking these steps. And like for example, of the guests that I've just interviewed, one is the co-founder of a like it's a grocery store that's supplies completely sustainable products, and they are full transparency, zero plastic, and talking about how we put in the systems at a community level that will lead to the long-term change. And then what, like you were just saying about trying to get the sponsors locally, that's my goal, to where I'm trying to maybe monetize the podcast and the pop-up at a more accelerated rate, is if I can show that, hey, we can reach this many people on the podcast for you, and we can reach this many people in person at our pop-up market. I think we will be able to get the revenue in the podcast quicker.
I mean, there's a world where you lean away from the community building, the wider topic, and actually just lean right into the local. And it's just the goal is really just to develop a local community, a Denver community, grow the audience around that pop-up, actually monetize it. And it'd be so much more straightforward to grow and monetize if it was literally just local news, community news, information for the community, all that kind of stuff, like real benefit, focus solely on Denver. But I understand your interest as well as in that wider community building too. So I don't know. There's definitely a little tension there that you maybe need to sort of try and think through at some point in the near future.
Yeah, figuring out that balance, being flexible right now, I think will be smart.
Yeah, yeah. There's something around that half and half though, or the 2/3 of the wider stuff, and then the bit at the end that everyone else can tune out of if they want. Maybe something in there.
Great
Matthew,
idea,
what about
Colin.
yeah, Matthew? What about yourself? Any thoughts on that side?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly erring towards the side of just doubling down on the local angle, and that doesn't mean that that's you shoehorned in there forever, but it gives you. I mean, what you're talking about doing with the market and everything, it sounds like you've got such a good basis to work on. You know, it sounds like really good things are happening already. So maybe just leaning into that just now, putting the wider world stuff on the back burner, and you can always return to that later. You're not closing any doors, but I think there's a great opportunity there for you to focus on some, and it cuts a lot of the all the other stuff that you'd be thinking about. It's much better if you could just get sort of laser focused at this stage. So it's food for thought, I reckon.
There's sorry to jump in there, but there's a one of the trends in podcasting at the moment is around like a lot of podcasts are most successfully monetizing through live events. Through they're really trying to figure out ways to get people in person. So you've got a huge audience building machine through your podcast itself, but the way to monetize it is to offer that in person personal experience and get people in a theater and something like that. And you have that almost ready made. You've got your pop up market. You could have a corner of it where you could even rope it off and it's actually a ticketed event, something like that. Or maybe it's the evening after the market where you can get people to stay back and it's tickets to go in, that kind of thing, and create something really special around that. So it's really worth thinking about because, like I say, there's shows out there that are trying to figure this out. They would love to have a place to record, an easy venue to just do that kind of thing in. So having that already is a really big advantage.
Yeah, and when I first started doing this, like podcasting in general, like 4 years ago in my school, the goal was to have this in-person through line to the podcast, but it's coming together at like the most opportune time where people in my community are focused on what we can do locally and not just focusing on the national level. So it's been really rewarding to see happen and build up. Even like it's me doing everything, and it's a ton of work, but doing the podcast and getting familiar with the podcast, I feel like really helped me be able to network and launch the pop-up market, because there's a very similar sort of like outreach. The more emails I send for doing the podcast and doing the pop-up market, the more successful I am. So
I'd be quite interested to hear, Cody, the sort of timeline of this. Like, how and when was everything sort of set up? What like order did it all fall in?
So it was the last time I published on this podcast was December 2024. And I knew that I wanted to shift to doing the like building a sustainable pop-up event. I had the venue, I had like the premise worked out, and then I had an unexpected trip to Prague in February of this year, and then that put it on hold, and then I came back, and then from there I just hit go, and then my first pop-up market was in March of this year. I just had my sixth one this past weekend, and then throughout the whole time of me doing this pop-up and getting it like the footing of it, I haven't published a podcast episode. And in part, I think that's a little bit of a blessing because I've been able to refocus the podcast to fit directly with this pop-up market, and I'm able to correlate the two on a much better in a much better way, I think. And so my first pop-up market was in March of this year, and then just until July of this past July, I felt like I was just getting the footing of what this pop-up market needs, how I grow it, what it needs to be impactful in my community. And now that I have the pop-up market up and running, my goal is to balance the pop-up market completely with a podcast where I'm focusing on the pop-up and the podcast hand in hand. And a part of the reason why I'm able to do in-person recording meetings is because this amazing workspace has like for 24-hour like workspace, free coffee from a great coffee shop, and 10 hours of podcast studio time locally here for like a very reasonable price. So I have like the workspace where I can actually do the podcast now as well, and I'm not just recording remotely. So it's this all has come together in the last 6 to 7 months.
Yeah, I'm just kind of piecing that all together. So I guess like you've not put an episode out for a while, and that's kind of giving you that opportunity just to regroup, I suppose, and think about your strategy. What would you say are kind of the immediate roadblocks then, or things maybe slight stumbling blocks that you're going to have to work your way around or figure out?
Yeah, so I think I'm getting into more of a routine where I'm sending out interview requests on a weekly basis, and I'm getting like my goal is to have five in-person interviews a month. And I think some of the hiccups that I'm see for this is, and this is from hiccups that I've had in the past with guests, is making sure that we like so I've recorded an episode, and then the episode, like, I wanna make sure that the guest is on the same page. I wanna build that trust with them, and I've had it where the podcast, like, I give it to them to, like, review and, like, maybe, like, that final, like, edit, or if you want anything to add or change, etcetera, and then the episode dies because they never get back to me, and, like, I'll put in all the work, it'll be a finished episode, and then it just doesn't ever see the light of day. I get the benefit of it because I've learned the information, and I've like produced the podcast episode, but I want to share that information with other people. So I guess just making sure that that like ways that I can avoid that from happening.
I'm sure Colin will have some thoughts on this. I'll just
Oh,
dive in
yes.
quickly with my own. So a couple of things here that I would do is if you get together a simple guest release form and get folks to sign that, and we always do this with caveats that we're not lawyers, etc., etc. But if you get something for them to sign beforehand, I think that's giving you permission to go ahead and publish the episode without getting back to them. I think almost all podcasts do that, to be quite honest with you. Or if you want to do that, reach out and give them some editorial control. It could just be a case of saying, okay, I've edited the episode. You'll find it in this Dropbox folder. It's going to go out on the 13th. That's 2 weeks from now. If you want to get back to me with any changes, you've got until the 7th. And if I don't hear from you, that's great. I'll put it out. So straight away, you're still offering them the opportunity, but you've not just handed them the ball and they've not
Yeah.
returned it, and that's you screwed. So, Colin, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that, Matthew. And the other way I see it working as well, quite nicely, is to actually say at the start of it, certainly, to relax your guest. Like, we can make any edits, so don't worry if you need to stop. Just let me know if we need to edit anything. We'll definitely figure that out. And then at the end of the recording, you say to them, right, was there anything in there, anything you can think of that you want me to make sure I cut out? And give them that time at the time, like actually in person, and say, was there anything you remember, anything you can think of you want to cut out? No? Okay, perfect. This will go out next week. And that's it. That is their editorial time. Because I think in 99% of the time, most people don't listen to it anyway. It takes a bit of time to go and listen through and give you actual feedback. And as long as you've given them that opportunity at the time, I think that's actually enough. But yeah, Matthew's approach is good as well if you want to give them a post review timeline as well, but with that deadline for sure.
When I was doing remote interviews, and when I first started doing the podcast, I was interviewing like a lot of environmental scientists and professors on the Livable Future podcast, the first one I did. And I found that a lot of these people who would give fabulous speeches and lectures in class, when it came to like a sit down interview, they didn't know the, like, "Oh, I should answer for, like, 3 to 5 minutes." Even though I write that out clearly, I say, "Hey, we wanna have a back and forth time." But there's such a stream flow of, like, some people where when they're talking, they don't know when to stop almost, and so I've been trying to figure out ways to include that, and, I think doing the in-person recording has really helped in the interviews that I've done this week. It's been much more of a fluid conversation and not like you're listening to a lecture, but I don't know if you have any advice for that?
Colin, you put together our interview course. You had a few good
Yeah.
tips on this, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. I mean, yeah, the in person makes a huge difference because suddenly body language is so much easier. Like you can lean forward with your mouth open so you can indicate you want to say something. Things like that just make it so much more of a fluid conversation, and people as well just feel like they're having a chat much more when they're staring you in the eye like that. So that does make a big difference. But I always have that conversation before every single interview. I say a few things to them. First of all, I do talk about you. It sounds like you're doing a bit of this already, but doing it verbally and saying, right, so this is we try and keep this really conversational. So do just, give like a 30-second, 60-second answer. If you feel like you're going on for more than a minute or so, definitely pause and let me jump in. And, I can direct it. Never feel like you have to give a huge long answer. Just give a kind of intro, and then I'll be able to direct us into the places I know that the listeners will be really interested in. And when you're doing that, making sure that you're giving them the benefit, the guest, the benefit as well. You say to the guest, like, because I know our listeners so well, I can make sure you come across the best way possible because I know exactly what they'll be interested in. So I can guide us. If you just give those short answers, I'll keep asking questions back and we'll definitely get all the way through everything you want to talk about. So that's always a good thing to do in the first place. The second is I always make it really clear when I'm talking to a guest in the 5 minutes before we hit record in person. Again, I say to them, look, I want to make sure you understand this. This is not going to be rude, but I know our listeners really well. I know exactly what they want to hear. So please don't be offended if I interrupt you. I will jump in. I'm going to jump in. You'll see me leaning forward. I'll be like waiting to jump in. And that just gives them a really good indication that this is going to happen. And it really makes them think much more about when they end up rambling on for 3, 4, 5 minutes at a time. So preparing them to be interrupted is a really big thing as well. And then I find as well, sometimes a nice way to get them eased into this approach as well is two things. So one is give them a soft question to start with. So something that is a bit more conversational. It doesn't lend itself to a big diatribe. It could even be just something around a hobby or something like that. You say, before we jump in, like I saw on your social media profile, you're into surfing. Like, tell me about that. When did you get into surfing? And they'll give you a wee story. And that is much more, familiar and much more easy for them. It'll put them off guard a little bit because they'll be expecting the work stuff. And you can end up editing that out if you like if it is completely irrelevant. But sometimes it does reveal a bit of personality that does actually improve the connection with the audience, and you can lead into the work from there. And the final part, sorry, going on a bit here, but the other part, I wrote a whole guide about this. The other
Love
part
it, it's
is
great.
a flagship story as well. And I think this is something that everyone should be doing at least once with every interview, but most people don't. And it is around asking that guest, what's the one story, the one learning, the one teaching that you give that you think resonates most with your audience? And having a bit of back and forth. This can be via email beforehand, or it can be via a 10-minute, catch-up call before when you're prepping. And they'll tell you, all right, okay, so there's this one thing that I teach, which always goes over really well. And you say, right, cool, break it down for me, will you? What's the 3 or 4 steps? And they say, right, okay, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can figure out a question for each step, and then you can break it. But when you break it down like that, you can say to them, right, okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you this question. You go through the first step. I'll ask you the next question, then the next step. And that suddenly starts to break it all down into much smaller chunks. And if you can kind of jump into that early in the episode, relaxes them because they know this is prepped. They know that they know that you know exactly what they want to go through. So you're going to complete it and that'll be all fine. But equally, it sets that precedent to go through little shorter chunks and for you to ask back. And it sets up that standard for what should be the format for the whole episode. And I find that can work really nicely to kind of get them into that cadence.
Colin, Matthew, that is excellent advice. I was taking notes on everything there, especially like just letting them know from the beginning, hey, like I do know what like the listeners want to hear, and like I will be interrupting you, so they expect that from the beginning. And then I also love your point about talking to them about the flagship story beforehand, so I can prepare that into the questions and the flow and break it down into bite-sized pieces instead of like a whole 10-minute monologue.
Yeah, it's so much more easy to do, but also more flexible than like planning out a whole interview, which is a lot of people what a lot of people think they should do. But actually, if you just have that one centerpiece, almost, you can let the rest of it almost evolve around that, as long as you've got a good idea of where you want to go. And one final one, actually, as well, is which does tend to set up this conversational element a bit more, is to make sure they're aware that they're encouraged to ask you a question back. It's something that you don't often hear on an interview. And sometimes, Matthew and I will be on a show and we're much more used to doing this. So we'll ask a question back of somebody that's interviewing us, and they're almost taken aback when you like bring in the interviewer. Whereas that's exactly what the listener wants. They know the interviewer better than you as the guest. So they want to hear both sides. And it sets up much more of a chemistry inducing, conversational back and forth as well. So that can be a really nice thing to do too. Quick interlude to say, if you enjoy the content we put out like this every single week, a great way to support it is through the products that we sell. So one of our products is Alitu. Alitu's our podcast creator app. It includes everything you need to make your podcast and is designed to make it as easy as humanly possible to put it all together and publish it to the world. It includes call recording. So there's a call recorder in there. You can record video calls, download that video to use elsewhere, take that call, put it into the podcast editor. It's a podcast specific editor that includes text-based editing. So you can edit your podcast like it's a document for those broad strokes. Go in there and clean up the fluff. And then you can get in and you can refine the detail with a waveform editor too. So it's got both to really handle everything from the broad strokes down to the detail. It's got magic filters to clean out those ums and ahs, to take away those silences. You can add background music, you can add in bleeps if you need them, and you can speed up to edit at 1.5 or 2 times speed as well. Then we've got our audio cleanup, which does noise reduction, leveling, voice EQ to make you sound great, and then finally to publish it to the world. We tie in to all of the big podcast hosts out there, so you can publish directly to your existing host, or you can use inbuilt Alitu hosting as well if you want to keep it all in one place. We've got a 7-day free trial, so you can go and try it out over at alitu.com. That's ALITU.com. 7 days to create an episode and see if you like it. And we'd love that support. Even if it's something that wouldn't suit you, you already have your workflow in place. If you could even tell 1 or 2 other people that you think Alitu might suit, whether it's new podcasters, whether it's existing podcasters wanting to save time, then it'd be greatly appreciated and really support the work we do and all the free content we put out. Thanks again.
Yeah, I don't have really much at all to add to all Colin's tips there, but thanks for giving me credit for them anyway, Cody. I got a wee shout out there. I did nothing. I went and had a cup of tea. But I guess one more thing, and Colin's kind of alluded to it, is just I think if the guest is confident that they're going to be allowed to talk about the things that they're keen to talk about, and hopefully it's the things that you've brought them on to talk about. So whether that's a quick conversation beforehand, is there anything you'd really like me to ask you about? Then you maybe find they're less inclined to ramble because they don't feel the need to shoehorn it in because they know that question is in the pipeline. So you maybe get sort of shorter and more succinct answers that way. But yeah, nothing really to add to all Colin's kind of said. Is that kind of, do you think that's enough on the kind of interview front? Because I'm obviously conscious of time and that we could deal with a few more of your maybe pressing
Yeah,
issues.
I would say so. I guess, so the way it sounds, you guys don't send your questions really beforehand when you interview guests?
There's a slight caveat there, Colin, isn't there? Because we wouldn't give a full list of questions, but there are certain questions we might send over, aren't there?
Yeah, totally. Like any big thinkers, we always think about sending over. So if it's something like, what's the book you'd most recommend to your audience? You know, that kind of thing. When it's something that you're kind of putting somebody on the spot to think up something good, or what's your, you know, what's the time that you made the biggest mistake in your life, or something like that. Like many people could just rattle off an answer to that, but others you'd want to give them time to think. And I think as well, giving them prep for those real thinker questions, it tends to create more unique content as well.
Yeah.
Because when you ask for favorite books, people will just come out with the thing that's top of mind, which is probably a book that everyone else has said as well. Whereas if you give them time to think about something like that, they're likely to feel inclined to find something a bit more unique that really showcases who they are. So yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I would rarely send over a full list of questions, but I would send, here's 5 or 6 things I would like to ask you, but there's going to be a whole lot of other stuff we'll dig into as well. And Matthew's point there was great as well. Like, make sure you put in at the end. So these are the ones I'm thinking about. But is there anything you'd definitely want me to ask you? That's like really highlight that.
What else is on your plate, Cody?
So I want to be on a consistent schedule for my podcast release, and I feel like I'm on track right now to do a bi-weekly release, but ideally I want to work towards a weekly release. And I guess just like your practical advice on what changes from a bi-weekly release to a weekly release in my schedule. Like I said, I'm trying to do about 5 in-person interviews a month. I can do remote interviews as well. Yeah.
Coincidentally, Colin, this is a conversation we had quite recently on the show, isn't that?
Yeah.
Episode will be out by now. So yeah, I mean, what's your sort of immediate thoughts there, or any follow up questions for Cody?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's all about workflow, isn't it? Thinking how to create that routine of getting this thing out every single week. I think doing it in person is really cool in that you can start to build that routine around doing that meetup, capturing that material, and then straight away getting into perhaps putting that out there in the world. Do you record at the same time every week, or is it possible that you can do that?
Maybe, since I could book the schedule the studio at the same time, so that's definitely on the table. I've been booking the studio when it's available for the guests that I can, book.
It's tricky, isn't it? When you're working with guests, you often have to work around their timelines. There's a couple of things here, Matthew. But you will have a bunch of stuff to jump in here too. But a couple of things around that workflow side of things. I always think the shows that I see get super consistent. They tend to absolutely nail down exactly what they're doing and when. And so, like Tuesday morning is every single week when they record and do at least like the first half of their production, just as an example. Or perhaps if they do have to be a bit more flexible, maybe they have 2 slots in the week that are a little bit interchangeable. So you can offer your guest either Tuesday AM or Thursday PM, let's say, just to fit in. And then one of those 2 days is the time you're producing your podcast. And that happens non negotiable every single week. So that's one starting point, which I'd really encourage. If you can find a way to make a routine so that you just know when it's happening every single week, tends to be when weekly shows get consistent and really start to succeed. So that's one part of it. What about yourself, Matthew? Anything you want to jump in with there?
I mean, a big starting point for me is always the realistic fact of how long it's taken you, and that'll vary from person to person. So if you've got an idea in mind of like how long this takes from the idea, from the reach out to a guest to hit and publish on an episode, and even the things you do after that in terms of promotion, you obviously need to consider all of that. So have you got like a rough kind of ballpark for that?
Yeah, it takes me, I would say, total about, depending on the episode, between 5 and 6 hours to record and get an episode out.
Yeah, And I mean, that is, if you're transitioning from fortnightly or bi-weekly to weekly, you obviously, the time needs to be available to do that, or you need to rethink the format and the workflow. And there are other options. We've spoke on the show recently about mixing up. Having guests on is great and obviously fits with your topic very well, but there are options to every second week to just do a short solo episode. The episode I listened to this morning, certainly the start of that, you were just talking yourself, up the mountains. So there are options to mix up the format and make it more sustainable, take some of that work out of it, but keep going with the kind of weekly schedule. So it depends on how bound you are to the interview format, or how up for mixing it up a wee bit that you might be.
Yeah, and I like both these ideas are great. I will try do my best to get on a regular schedule where I'm letting people know that this is my podcast studio time, and if they want to be a guest, like we can do these couple of times. And I think 95% of guests that will fit with, and there might be like that 5% where I might have to make like some changes. But I think overall I don't see that being an inhibitor for the people coming on the podcast. So I love the idea of like having a weekly podcast studio time. And then when I was first considering the relaunch, I was considering of maybe just doing a back and forth, like you just said, Matthew, where it was one episode me interviewing someone and then one episode just me breaking down information and the facts. And I'm not against doing that. I just want to make sure that I'm enjoying that aspect of the podcast, because when I was doing those solo episodes, they were taking me like when I'm looking at that schedule that I was on before when I was just doing a solo episode, I was releasing once a month, which was way too low. And I think a part of that is because I was struggling to believe in the episode more. So the fact that I have that back and forth with people, I love the conversation, but I'm not against doing just a solo episode.
If I could just jump in there, Matthew, that was the second good point bringing that up. That was the second part I was going to come to, was the formats. That's great. The other way to do it is the co-host, of course. So if you're not comfortable with solo episodes, can you find one of these guests that you've been talking about, or somebody in your team, or somebody that's involved in the pop-up that you can actually talk to every other week? Because they tend to be a lot easier to prepare for. They tend to be a lot more controlled, a lot easier to edit and put out there too. So maybe second only to solo shows, like a good co-host can actually make your workflow pretty easy too. And especially if they can commit to, every Tuesday morning, as an example, every other week, maybe that's your kind of alternating routine. That could work quite nicely too.
Yeah, I could definitely see myself working with a co-host. When I was doing my first podcast, I really wanted us to go to that format of just like, the co-host talking back and forth about a subject. I've also found it where for me, it's been harder to get people who see the same vision or on the same page, or the first time when we were doing the podcast, when it was sort of like an equal 50-50 split, it almost also felt like sometimes there was too many cooks in the kitchen. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case this time, since it would be like my show that I've launched from the beginning. But I would love to have a podcast host as well to help join me, even if it's on, like you said, once every 2 weeks.
Any more add on that front, Con?
No, I mean, I think that could work really nicely. It's even, recurring guests can work quite nicely for that. So, like, if you do have a couple of guests that you have particularly good chemistry with, and it's not the same one every 2 weeks, but you have two or three people who tend to be on, whenever you need a co-hosted episode, you bring one of them on, you invite one of them on, and they become quite comfortable on the mic as well, and comfortable with the format. It's a kind of less regular co-host, but most of the benefits of that too.
I was just gonna say, I am talking with my guests already about having them come back as like that reoccurring guest. So
Yeah.
I am, yes. I guess the other real thing on my mind is when I would be looking up like podcast information by Googling it or on the internet, I would often come on resources and then discover it was from you guys, from your team. And I think you do a brilliant job of creating this podcast to be accessible across all like the different platforms where people would want to consume this information. I guess what advice would you have for helping podcasts switch to being like a text or blog resource?
Colin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that we've talked about a lot over the last few years around show notes, essentially, or getting away from that word show notes, because I think of it more largely than that. Because every content idea you come up with, it's almost a waste to think of it as just one type of content. So, this is my podcast episode plan, or this is my blog post plan, or this is my social media plan. Instead, I think of it as every content idea you come up with, anything you think you can talk about on your podcast, then that can be everything else as well. And so creating that structure, so you think, right, what's the hook of this piece of content? You know, what's the intro? What are the sections of it? What's the meat of it? What's the outro? Then you've got that bullet point plan for the content. And then you can go and speak it. So you can go and deliver it on the podcast by all means, if that's the best way to do it. But then often in the olden days, I would just go away and I would write a blog post straight away, because I always found it really quick and easy actually to write something after I had just spoken it. It was somehow you've processed it in your head, you've got it kind of fresh, you've come up with a few new ideas as you were speaking and processing. And it was quite often quite easy to write 4, 5, 600 words on that topic at the time. And really, that's a big part. And both Matthew and I doing this is a big part of how I think we grew a lot of visibility in during the 2010s up to 2020 and beyond, is because we were doing that. We were doing the written version and the audio version, but they were all coming from that one content idea. And then later we were repurposing that into videos as well, and shorts and social media and everything. So I think it is a lot about thinking about that content idea rather than just being one thing. It's something you repurpose into everything. And of course, you can't talk in 2025 and not talk about the fact that you can do this with AI as well, really. You can take the transcript from your podcast, it makes it a lot easier. You can give it good prompts, which mean that it retains your voice quite well as well. So you can say, like, take this transcript, learn from the way we speak, the words we use. We're Scottish origin, British English. You know, this is a wee bit about our personality. We're maybe a wee bit irreverent, a wee bit more, self-effacing, all that kind of stuff. Put that into it as well, and create me a blog post based on this. And then you always have to go and edit it. You always have to do that's a first draft. You know, it's an assistant that creates that first draft for you, but it can save you a lot of time on that too. So that's really the core of it, is the slog work of creating written versions of what you put out there. But I think with that workflow, whether it is you just go and write it straight away, you just brain dump it onto the page, or you use AI to create that messy first draft and then edit from there, I think that is a great way to go about it and start putting them out there onto the web.
Before the AI resources, became available, how long would you say it would take you to write that blog post?
I think it would be about an hour. I would
Hour?
account for up to an hour to do that. So maybe half an hour for that first kind of splurge it onto the page, and then maybe 20 minutes to kind of go back through it and do an edit. And that is quite a short amount of time compared to what a lot of people sort of claim that it takes to write a blog post. I think there was a combination of practice, just doing it every single week, and the fact that you've just spoken the topic, and the fact that you've planned it already as well. You've got that plan there, that structure. Like, so much of blog writing is attempting to structure it. So much of what I see people writing blogs and wasting time on it is attempting to structure it as they go along. You know, you've got a vague idea, you start writing, and you end up messing around for half a day because you keep changing things around. But if you have that plan in place ahead of time, you then speak it and then you write it, actually, that kind of batch process makes for much easier writing, in my opinion.
Yeah, and my goal with this is to try to turn it into, like, opinion editorials where I can send it to the local newspapers, where we can maybe get published in their editorial section, and, again,
Yeah.
more ways to reach the local audience.
That's really cool. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you can definitely, like, once you've got the written version, the audio version, you've got the transcript there, you're probably going to repurpose it into a couple of social posts, perhaps, put it out on LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever it is that works for you. Then by the time you have those versions, you've got everything you need to tweak it into an editorial, into whatever other format that paper will require. So, yeah, it's a nice idea. In fact, a lot of printed papers, even online papers, will take an existing article, because they're not too fussed about search results. They're all about timely content. So they'll actually license essentially the blog post you've already written,
Wow.
duplicate it onto their site, and just give you a reference back to it, essentially.
Excellent
Cool.
advice. Thank you for that breakdown.
Cool. The other thing I was going to get back to, maybe we need to finish up on this. We're kind of keeping you a while here, but it was just a quick question, really, to dig just a final thing on the workflow. Really, the 6 hours you were talking about there for an episode, that's not outrageous by any means. We've heard much longer than that, but it's still on the kind of quite time-consuming upper end of what I think you need to spend on an episode. Do you know what, just top of mind, like what are the top one or two things in there that take up that time? Like what's the most time-consuming elements of that?
Editing is a third of that, and then I'm including a 2-hour like, recording window. Like, I had
Ah, okay.
like so in that recording window, I'm actually recording for an hour, but I, like, arrive early to make sure that the studio, because it's a shared studio, so I make sure that the studio's where I needed to be, and me sitting down and, like, getting into the frame of, "Hey, I'm hosting, this is, like, where I want the conversation to go and how I see the vision." So from without that initial hour, I would say it's about 5 hours, 2 hours is editing, sometimes 2.5 hours. I'm new to editing where we're both in the same room. I'm used to editing, like, over Riverside or where it's not picking up everyone's audio at once. So, learning how to edit in while I'm in the room in person will help make this go faster, and then research as well. I think I do sometimes too much research into a topic, but I'll read a book before I interview a guest or things like that. So I don't know how to, like, account for that sort of time as well.
I think, Matthew, tell me what you think in a sec, but like I think that's actually a pretty good balance. I wouldn't change too much about that in that case. That 2 hour recording, obviously that's totally fine. That's what it takes to record an hour long, especially if you have to prep in person. The research, like don't cut that. That is the part to spend your time. Often we're trying to encourage people to take time from, perfecting their edit to bring it forward into creating better content in the first place. Actually, usually that's a better idea. So a 2 hour edit is definitely not unreasonable. I think it's potentially possible you could cut that. I would often say, if you're putting out something if you're putting out a normal podcast, you can often, I find you can often edit it in the same amount of time it takes to record. So you're going to try and you're not going to listen through every word. Matthew will disagree with me on this, but we kind of have slightly different opinions on this. I often try and encourage people to cut the editing as much as possible and concentrate on the content itself. But it's definitely an opinion, my opinion, rather than anyone else's. And that's because I don't listen to every word. I'll actually note down at the end or make notes actually during recording of the bits I need to edit while I'm actually recording it. And that can be a way to cut down the time. But what do you think, Matthew? Do you think 2 hours is pretty reasonable for an hour recording?
Yeah, well, firstly, just to reiterate, I agree as well about the research. I think if you took time away from that, it would only get added on again, try to fix things at the other side. So yeah, I think we're all in agreement on that front. On the editing front, yeah, I mean, talk me through kind of how the editing works. Like you were talking about editing as you went, and I'm not familiar with Riverside's editing tools at the moment. And what did you kind of mean by editing, like as you record, if that's what you said?
So I don't edit while I record. I I don't use Riverside's editing tools. I use Adobe Audition. And a part of that right now is because in the studio we'll have the two microphones, and the two microphones, they're picking up both voices because they're so close. So, like, right now, one of the first steps I do is just isolating the microphones for the speakers, and then I compile it. If I look at where, oh, they're rambling too long or this isn't interesting, I'll edit that. And I'm focusing on what I think is actually interesting, what people would want to hear, and what I think is, like, useful information.
Yeah, Audition, that's like the platform that I've used the most in my however many years now podcasting. But when I'm editing in Audition, I'll highlight both tracks and squash them down to 50% speed and listen back through it. And then at the end of it, where I've made all the cuts, I'll just pull it back up to 100%. Not quite as intuitive as changing a playhead speed, but that's what Audition's got. So I don't know if that's something you've been trying. I know some folks simply don't like listening at fast speeds, but it saves me a lot of time if I'm using Adobe Audition.
I need to do it more, honestly, because I haven't been, but I that will really help save my time just because I can get through the audio twice as fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Adobe's it's a decent platform still, but that is certainly a time saving way. In addition itself. So, how much are you kind of chop 'em out or moving around? Like, how does your edits kind of look?
I try to keep it as, authentic as possible to the interview. I have had it where, like I think we talked about this earlier, where, like, that first question that you ask a guest, they're, like, nervous, they're not really ready for it. So, I do try to sometimes start with, like, a question that will ease them into it that I'll cut out later because it's, not as interesting. But, I do try to keep in this it goes into my planning beforehand where I try to structure it where it will make sense as an episode.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, editing it, no matter what way you look at it, you need to spend some time on it. But yeah, there'll be some wee things that you could do to speed up the process, certainly. But aye, it's uh, it's a difficult challenge sometimes, isn't it? Colin, have you got any thoughts? Any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think you're saying all the right things here. You're not giving any of the normal warning bells here, which is you're not saying I'm spending 3 hours editing out every and or perfecting the EQ and the compression and all that kind of stuff. Like, if you're going to spend 2 hours editing a 1 hour interview, the way to do it is to cut it down, is to cut down the fluff, to cut out the fluff, to pick the parts that are interesting. That is the kind of editing that does actually improve the quality of a show. It's the kind of thing that often, we don't encourage people necessarily to do in the early days or to spend a whole lot of time on. There's often other things that are more valuable in impact, but that's the highest impact editing task that you can find, which is basically curating, an hour long good interview into a 40-minute excellent interview, because it's just higher impact, higher value per minute, essentially. Or that's at least my opinion again. Does that sound right, Matthew?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Sort of last few minutes, Cody. Any sort of wee quick fire things we could help you with, just as we get wrapped up before we ask you where to find the podcast?
I really think we covered a lot of information here. It's been these questions that I've had built up for a while where I don't have a lot of other people in the podcasting community to ask. I guess just really quick, I also run a podcast meetup group where I'm trying to build like a community of podcasters. We have like over 1100 people who are part of this podcast meetup group locally. Do you have any advice for podcasters getting together locally and what we can do to help each other?
Bring cakes.
Well, we meet at a bakery, so check.
Good,
Oh, yes.
you've got it all in place. Yeah, Colin, we used to run a meet up a few years ago, didn't we? Any
We did.
memories of that? It's a bit hazy, but
Yeah, it's a while back. It's a while back.
yeah.
But I think a big part of podcasting is that it does feel quite isolated sometimes. Like, even though we're talking to new guests every week, like the questions you've just asked a bunch of here, Cody, and the questions that are always kind of going through your mind, or how do I grow it? How do I monetize it? That's the kind of stuff you feel a bit more alone on, isn't it? So a big part of groups like that, and we found that with ours, was just, being able to just have a bit of a moan actually at each other and have somebody who has the same things in common. But I think maybe one of the more practical ones is we did a couple of times was say to everyone, please do bring along, one anecdote about this particular theme, based on this particular theme. And one time it was maybe growth. Like, what is one thing you did to grow in the last year that actually worked for you? And just say, like, just need 60 seconds, 120 seconds, like 1 or 2 minutes, and just tell us a little story of one thing you did. Bring that along, and that can be shared with the group. And you can do that for, a growth one week, and then maybe a how to earn from your show the next week, how to improve your workflow, the week after, something like that. So I think those kind of little tips where you go around the room and just share that actually work really nicely, and kind of almost give you more than, asking someone to do a 15-minute talk or something like that.
Yeah, I do remember that. It worked really well, and it just saved everyone kind of awkwardly turning up, especially folk for the
Yes.
first time, and nobody's really getting the chat started or that. So
Yeah.
it's just great to have that. Like, we're not formal, but everyone's bringing their own wee anecdote, and I think it's as well having the gumption, if you like, to notice if maybe somebody's a bit more quiet, maybe a bit more reserved, and then on the flip side, you maybe get some more dominating characters that are holding court, and it's just trying to make sure you're bringing people in and letting them speak, even if they've maybe, ironically, been podcasters. We would assume that, as talkers, but that people aren't always like that. They can still be very shy in person. So I think there's just a bit of anchormanship. Is that a term? I don't know, but we're coining it, so
Yeah.
we'll go with it.
Yeah, and what I found in the meetup group, there's a lot of people who want to get started in the podcasting community, and I would really like to have the people who are already podcasting where we can get together. But for all the people new to podcasting, I recommend listening to Podcraft because you guys cover everything from A to Z from podcasting. And thank you so much for having me on my favorite podcast about podcasts.
Thank you, Cody.
You're most
It's nice
welcome.
to
Very
hear.
kind.
Yeah. Well, let's hear where we could find your show then, Cody. Where could the listener go to check it out?
Yeah, so we're about to launch, and we've rebranded to the Community Build Up Podcast. And it's a show about elevating the people, building more sustainable, resilient, and creative communities. And you'll be able to stream it anywhere you listen to podcasts. And the goal is to be released by mid-September. So hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be published.
Due to that, we'll be phoning you at 3 a.m. Is that podcast out yet? No, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and it sounds like you're doing really good work, and I've got all confidence that you'll kick on with it. So yeah, thank you for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you guys so much.